I'm an experienced in-home nurse. In 5 years, I've encountered a variety of patients. I'll admit, there were some problematic ones, but I chalked it up to them being irritated with their respective medical problems. Overall, I'm happy with my career, but there was this one patient that nearly drove me to quit. Her name was Mrs. Perrywood. I was hired to look after Mrs. Perrywood by her son, George. He needed someone to stay with his mom while he was on a business trip. I should clarify that George wanted someone to stay in Mrs. Perrywood's house during the trip. For context, the company I work for is the kind where nurses are available 24/7. I was selected to take care of Mrs. Perrywood. George promised to pay the company and me a hefty sum once he returned from his trip. When I arrived at her house, I was amazed by its appearance. Mrs. Perrywood's home was like a mansion. George met me outside and invited me into his home. Once inside, he explained the situation to me. George owned a successful business and lived on his own, but recently, he learned that his mom wasn't doing so well. George loved his mom, so he moved back in with her. He needed a nurse while on his business trip in case anything happened. I was touched by George's story. I respected him for caring so much for his mother's well-being to the point where he'd live with her. George led me to his mother's room. Mrs. Perrywood was sitting in her bed reading a book when we entered her room. She turned to face us and smiled. George approached his mom and kissed her on the cheek. He then gestured for me to come forward and introduced me. Before leaving, George gave me his number in case of any emergencies. The first day was great. Mrs. Perrywood was the sweetest woman I'd ever met. All we did was talk about our lives and families. During one of our conversations, Mrs. Perrywood mentioned that she had an older son named James. James stopped visiting her some time ago. He even stopped talking to George. Neither Mrs. Perrywood nor George could understand the sudden estrangement. I felt sorry for the family. How could James abandon them like that? That night, I slept in the bedroom next to Mrs. Perrywood's. I don't know why, but I woke up in the middle of the night. At the time, I happened to be facing the direction of the bedroom door. I immediately sat up when I saw a silhouette in the middle of the room. I turned on the lamp on the nightstand and was relieved to see that it was Mrs. Perrywood. I asked Mrs. Perrywood what she was doing up. She said that she wanted to make sure that I didn't leave. I helped her back to her bed. It wasn't until I got back to bed that it finally dawned on me. Mrs. Perrywood had trouble walking, and I kept my door open in case she needed something. If Mrs. Perrywood had tried to walk alone, she would have fallen. If she did, the thud from the impact would have woken me up. I also wondered why she wanted to make sure that I was still around. I was always loyal to my clients. Did she not trust me? One morning, I was having breakfast with Mrs. Perrywood when I heard someone banging on the door. I then heard an older man's voice calling George's name. I could tell by his tone that he was furious. I grabbed my phone and went to the front door. Through the peephole, I saw a well-dressed man with blonde hair. He ordered George to let him in. I yelled at the intruder, telling him to leave or I'd call the cops. He stopped banging and looked confused. The man asked who I was and what I was doing in his mom's house. I explained who I was and that I was a nurse hired by George. The intruder stood there, looking as if I had said something unbelievable. He introduced himself as James, George's brother. I was surprised. The guy who disappeared from his family's life suddenly reappeared on his mom's doorstep. James asked where George was. I told him that George was on a business trip and wouldn't be home for a few days. James facepalmed and muttered something under his breath. He then got into his car and drove away. I got a bad feeling and called George. After telling him what happened, George told me that he would deal with James. When George returned from his business trip, I was watching TV with Mrs. Perrywood. We were commenting on the terrible acting in an old show when we heard a screaming match from outside. I went to the front door to investigate. I looked through the peephole and saw George and James arguing. The house was on the outskirts of my town, so there were no neighbors around. "How many times do I have to tell you, George?" James yelled. "Mom doesn't need a nurse." "Mom has struggled to move for the past month, James," George argued back. "It's not like you'd been any help." I was about to grab my phone to call the police when James shouted something that shook me to my core. "I can't help Mom because she's dead," James screamed. I felt my heart sink. I turned around and saw Mrs. Perrywood standing behind me. Her skin was pale, her hair was a ratty mess, and her clothes were tattered. In a raspy voice, she thanked me for spending time with her. I screamed and ran out of the house. James caught me and asked what had happened. I struggled to tell James about Mrs. Perrywood. He didn't understand a word I said. George, however, knew exactly what was going on and explained everything. It turned out that Mrs. Perrywood had died of heart complications a month prior, but despite her death, Mrs. Perrywood never left her home. Her spirit stayed in the house with George. When George told James about it, he didn't believe him. James thought that his brother was in denial. That's why he stopped visiting the house. I noticed James looking at the house in horror. George and I followed his eyes and saw Mrs. Perrywood in one of the windows. She smiled and waved at us. The three of us vowed to never speak of Mrs. Perrywood's ghost. The last thing we wanted was to scare an entire town. I haven't seen or heard from the Perrywood brothers since that day. All I know is that neither of them hired a nurse again. Later, I learned that Mrs. Perrywood's death wasn't made public before I was hired. After returning home, George announced his mother's death and held a funeral for her. As far as I know, Mrs. Perrywood's spirit is still with George. I also feel that this new revelation helped George and James reconcile. At least I can rest easy knowing that no other nurse would go through what I went through.